Hello, welcome everybody. Let me introduce myself, John McDonnell, the elected Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington and former Shadow Chancellor. First of all, thanks a lot for everyone participating and coming on this evening online. Let me explain the background to this discussion, and I'll introduce our speakers, participants in that discussion. Sometime a few weeks back, Gabriel Winant did an article one of our American comrades did an article in Dissent, which was circulated quite widely. I think it was Clive Lewis who sent a copy to me. And what Gabriel did was he did a fairly incisive analysis of why Trump won and why the Democrats under Harris failed. I think most of us were still recovering from the shock of Trump winning again. But what he did in that article, he indicated, I thought, quite incisively some of the lessons for the left in the US, but also the left generally. It was good to see in the article as well the quotes from Stuart Hall, an old comrade who no longer with us, unfortunately. In this country, we always pride ourselves as socialists as being internationalists, but I don't think we do have enough international engagement, particularly with the US left. So one of the ideas we had was just to bring a group of the left comrades together who, in the US, have, I think, provided quite an important role in analysing, in a scholarly form in many instances, the politics of the US and its implications for the rest of the globe. So we put together a panel who you'll hear from tonight. And I'm really sorry about Keeanga, who was going to be with us, has gone down with a fever today. She's let us know she's just not very well. And so I'm sorry about that. And it means also that we've got an all-male panel, which again, I apologise for. It certainly wasn't our intention. I'm going to try and contact Keeanga to see if she'll come back and have another discussion with us online. But the idea is simply to invite a few speakers just to give us their analysis of why Trump won. How did we get in this situation? Look at the implications of that victory, and then discuss where does the left go from here. And I think it's about learning some lessons, of course, about what the left does internationally and globally, because Trump's election has implications for all of us. In fact, it has quite fearful consequences, I think. So that's the intention of this discussion. I'll ask the speakers to introduce themselves, because whenever I do this, I always get the wrong titles or the long backgrounds. And this will be very much an informal discussion. I'll ask the speakers to do 8 to 10 minutes each and presenting their analysis, but then the idea is to open it up for questions and bring people together for a proper discussion. I want to come away from this discussion with a much clearer understanding of, what happened, but actually where do we go from here? And how can we build the links of analysis, but also action between the US left and the left in this country? And then how do we go on from there? Okay, so our first speaker is Gabriel Winant, known as Gabe. I'm just a brief introduction from me. I met Gabe during COVID because he set up online a reading group where we read E.P. Thompson's The History of the Making of the English Working Class, which one I think was one of the most seminal books in the development of really thinking about our own history and class analysis in this country. And it was a proper reading group as well, quite challenging, not just the pace, but also the range of speakers and issues that we know. So that's how I met Gabe. So he was naturally the first person I turned to when I was trying to set up discussion. Gabe, over to you.
Right. Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And it was. I look back very fondly on that E.P. Thompson reading group from 4 years ago, and it was. It remains an inspiration to have political leadership who are engaged with challenging analytical questions as well as kind of practical political ones. My name is Gabe Winant. As John said, I teach history. I'm a labor historian. I work at the University of Chicago. I'm here in Chicago now. I'm an elected officer in the American Association of University Professors. and which is sort of my trade union side. I should also plug another labor history podcast that I've been doing that's coming to an end shortly, but a limited run. If you're interested in American labor history, it's called Fragile Juggernaut, and it tells the story, along with me and 5 other comrades, the story of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is the kind of most dynamic phase of the American labor movement arising in the 1930s. So that's called Fragile Juggernaut. If you're interested, there are about 50 hours of it available so far, almost done. So I'll just start off by kind of recapitulating some of what I said in the dissent piece that John mentioned and kind of trying to introduce the arguments of it here. But I'd like to start in an unexpected place, actually. There's been, since Trump first appeared on the national scene a decade ago, there's been a kind of back and forth ongoing discussion about whether we should be thinking or talking about a threat of fascism. I'm not going to try to directly take that on or answer that here. We can go into it more if we want. But a consistent reference point for those discussions on the left has always been Karl Marx's classic essay on the rise of the figure who would become Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. And the key piece of analysis in that essay is that coming out of the 1848 revolution in France, the middle class forces of liberalism, although they were interested in the political support of the working class in order to confront their own antagonists, as it had happened earlier in the 18th century, they were unwilling to concede any leadership to the working class forces with whom they were in coalition, and that ultimately, that antagonism between those classes eventually led the democratic revolution to disintegrate and allowed the emergence of a form of dictatorship in the form of the Second Empire of Louis Napoleon. That essay has been a classic reference point on the left for trying to understand forms of populist authoritarianism for the entirety of the 20th century. And it's worth, I think, revisiting continually in thinking about and trying to make sense of a phenomenon like Trump. The decisive feature of American politics that has allowed the rise of Trump and the increasing consolidation of Trumpism and its coalition, it seems to me, is the commitment of our center-left party, or we call them liberals. I know that term translates differently somewhat in the UK, but the commitment of liberalism to suppressing its challengers from the left. The Democratic Party has been, for its entire existence, both the party of the working class and the party of the left wing of the ruling class, and that duality has in contradiction has existed within it since at least the early 20th century in some form. The internal balance of power fluctuates, it changes, it shifts. In certain moments, working class forces have gained more power, left-wing forces have gained more power within that coalition, but never totally capturing the driver's seat of it. The distinguishing kind of weakness, it seems to me, of the Harris campaign was the way that it essentially capitulated on every contentious policy question, sought to marginalize the left in order to situate itself as squarely as possible in the political center. I don't think this is an unfamiliar dynamic in British politics, but it's one of to which the Democrats have repeatedly returned in the face of Trumpism, on the theory that Trump is such a aberrant and deviant figure in American politics that the proper way to relate to him is to try to politically ostracize and legally, and then ultimately legally ostracize him from American politics, rather than to engage on the substantive issues that he has successfully raised and offer a counter argument. So I think the clearest version of this occurs in relation to immigration. Right, immigration is the signature issue for the populist far right in this country, as I think it is in your country. And Harris, like many Democrats, is now engaged over the course of her campaign in trying to attack Trump from the right on immigration. This is, again, I think a familiar move probably in your own political repertoire, accusing him of being insufficiently committed to building the wall on the border that was his signature slogan and demand in his first run, for example. Another kind of key place where we see the move to the center was in relation to the politics of Palestine and the Israeli genocide unfolding in Gaza. Over the course of the past year, there was a sustained social movement and mobilization, both inside the Democratic Party's electoral process, and Waleed can talk about this if he wants. He played a leading role in it, and also in the streets and on university campuses to demand a change in policy toward Israel and toward the war that it's conducting. This manifested in the form of nearly 1 million votes for essentially a nobody in Democratic primary elections, the uncommitted campaign, right? Democratic voters went into their primary elections and voted for no candidate as a form of expressing a protest against the party's policy toward Israel and Palestine, which is 1 million more votes than Kamala Harris got in Democratic primaries, or 800,000 more, since she got none. She did not run at that phase. There was a massive wave of protest, obviously, and repression of that protest, particularly on university campuses in the spring. And this brought out a significant internal tension in the Democratic coalition that Harris essentially just sought to ignore and to offer sort of symbolic expressions of sympathy in hopes that would diffuse the demand that she engage in some kind of policy change toward Palestine and Israel, and she refused to do anything of the kind. Infamously refused to allow a Palestinian to speak at the Democratic National Convention, despite a significant mobilization demanding that. So just these are two signature kind of major issues of the election. There are many others one could name where the pattern is the same, where essentially liberal forces, the center left of the Democratic Party that was in control of it, opted to, at best, ignore, at worst, suppress demands from the left for active contestation of the issues on which the far right is gaining ground, and instead sought to just capture the center, isolate the right as deviant. And in this way, there emerged no coherent political program from the Democrats. What Harris was meant to stand for was totally unclear. She was unable to even really speak convincingly and compellingly about any issue because her own form of political rhetoric expressed the kind of hesitancy and defensiveness and incoherency of this policy posture. And the Democrats were left, as they have done repeatedly over the past decade, in the position of saying, things are actually better than the electorate thinks, and the electorate should be more grateful for what Democrats have already delivered. So Hillary Clinton did this in 2016, infamously, America is already great. And Harris repeated a version of this rhetoric. It's a structural kind of endemic issue in the Democratic Party because of the cross-class coalition that it represents. This led the image of the party and the image of the candidate to become essentially imperceptible to the public, if not to seem outright mendacious in some way. It's notable that Harris, like Hillary Clinton in 2016, had higher personal favorability ratings with the public. It's not that Trump is exactly such a popular figure. Rather, it's that he has a kind of clear and, in a sense, positive or affirmative policy program that he's offering, which, although it speaks falsely to the real economic and social problems that Americans experience, does speak to them. And the Democrats have simply declined to speak to those problems and allowed Trump to politicize questions like inflation, questions like immigration, questions like housing costs on their own terms. That has led to a fiasco, I think. It's fair to say. The election of Trump is marked not just by repeating the 2016 victory, but by an extension of his coalition into traditional Democratic constituencies. He has significantly improved Republican numbers among Black and Latino voters, for example, which remain Democratic constituencies, but by smaller margins than they historically have been. And this is a class phenomenon in some way, right? It would be going too far to say the Republicans have successfully realigned themselves as the working class party, but they have, I think we can say, de-aligned party politics from class politics, so that the Democrats no longer play the role that they have played since at least the 1930s of being the kind of default representative of the working class, however insufficiently they've done that. That's a disaster of, I think, significant historic magnitude. And in response to it, what I fear we're going to see is the further kind of preemptive compliance of mainstream liberalism with the forms of repression that are coming down the pipeline now. So a familiar issue to you all will be the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, for example, which the Democratic leader in the U.S. Senate, Charles Schumer, is currently trying to encode into law at many levels of society, right? In universities, in schools, in nonprofits, there is an anticipation of a coming wave of political repression that will be carried out through the tax system, through various mechanisms like that. For example, the fear around the tax system is that the administration will strip nonprofit status from politically progressive, objectionable organizations. For example, pro-Palestine advocacy organizations will be designated as terrorist supporting in some way. And many American organizations and institutions are moving to kind of preemptively begin to comply with this coming wave of repression, including elements of the Democratic Party who have already, in some sense, been collaborating with it. From my perspective, that's an enormous threat to the weak forms of democracy that we already had in this country. In some sense, it also generates an opportunity, though, in as much as the left has always been locked in this kind of complex alliance and antagonism simultaneously with liberal political leadership. That will go on. The left doesn't constitute a majority in this country. It needs liberal coalition partners in order to achieve its political goals. But to the extent that our liberal coalition partners who lead liberal nonprofits, lead universities, lead these kinds of institutions, to the extent that they begin to collaborate with Trump, they will, I think, default a certain amount of political leadership to the left and give us an opportunity to present more of our vision. And there has been a significant period of, in particular, labor movement rebuilding and re-energization over the past decade. Our numbers are still too small in the labor movement, but I think there are many, many more militant left-wing leaders in the labor movement than there were a decade ago. And there will be an opportunity there for us to present an alternative vision and more directly challenge liberal institutional leaders for the position of spokespeople against the far-right threat that Trump represents. So I will stop there for now. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks again.
Thanks, Gabe. That's really helpful. We'll come back with the questions that are coming in once we've heard from everybody. There's a complexity of the analysis here, and I think we face exactly the same problems, especially with the threat to basic democracy in both our countries at the moment. Let's come on then to Waleed Shahid. Waleed, I'd like you to introduce yourself, but you've been at the front line of a lot of this, particularly with regard to your role in the Justice Democrats for a number of years as well. Give us your analysis of why Trump won and what the lessons are.
Thank you so much, John, for organizing this panel. Yeah, I'm a campaign strategist, campaign tactician, and so I have some of the more concrete, detailed campaign tactics analysis approach, while with also some of the bird's eye view. I was the spokesperson for an organization called Justice Democrats, which helped recruit and elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Summer Lee, and two members of the squad, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, who were recently defeated in a primary by AIPAC-backed candidates. AIPAC is the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. And I'm one of the founders of the Uncommitted movement, which Gabe mentioned, that basically in some ways tried to produce a spectacle of no confidence in Biden in the spring of 2024 that was in some ways a premonition of what was to come. I think that one thing to make clear is that the Harris campaign is engaged in major spin currently to make people convinced that this election was unwinnable. They've appeared on Pod Save America, a popular podcast, to basically put forward the line that every incumbent party in the Western world has lost re-election in 2024, and therefore it was basically impossible for Democrats to win, given post-COVID malaise and dissatisfaction with cost of living and inflation. The truth is, the election was winnable. People have compared this election to like the anecdote that people or the data point that people bring up is that 3 out of 100 voters switched their votes this time around. And so it wasn't, as Gabe said, it's not a massive realignment to the Republican Party. It's not a watershed election or a landslide election for Donald Trump. And it's frankly a bit pathetic for the leading Democratic strategist and Harris strategist to say that might as well not have spent nearly $1 billion on this election if this election was unwinnable. So the key that out of those 3 out of 100 voters who switched from either Biden to Trump or from Biden to not voting, a vast number of those voters were what we call low information voters, meaning voters who don't pay attention to political news or mainstream media on a daily basis, who make their voting choices pretty late into the election cycle, primarily working class communities, non people who haven't attended college, and a large percentage, a disproportionate percentage of men and people of color who voted for Trump this time around or didn't vote at all, but did vote in 2020. I think a major piece of this, my father is one of these voters who has voted Democrat his entire life. My mom as well, who did not vote for Vice President Harris this time around, and a primary driver of that was obviously Gaza. But when I asked my dad why didn't he vote for Harris, he didn't. Gaza wasn't the first thing he brought up. He asked me, what has Harris done in the past 4 years? And fundamentally, that was probably, in my sense, the number one issue for most of the voters who switched or didn't vote. They could not point to a single concrete achievement or a concrete material benefit that either Vice President Harris or President Biden had done for them in the past 4 years to address their number one concern, which were pocketbook issues and issues of inflation. As many people know, for the past few decades, costs of healthcare, college education, hospital services, childcare, elderly care, housing have skyrocketed in the United States. And in many focus groups, when you ask voters to compare the Democratic Party to an animal, the animal that people will bring up is a sloth or a tortoise. When you ask people to conjure up an animal representing the Republican Party, people will pretty much always bring up predators, tigers, lions. And so that's kind of the malaise in which the Democratic Party is swimming in, which is that they're perceived as a party that debates and discusses and sells people a bill of goods and doesn't actually deliver for them. And so why not take a risk on someone promising change, or why not vote at all? And so I think the product that there's been all this discussion about how the Democrats need to do better on podcasts and YouTube and TikTok, but fundamentally the product was flawed. And there was a sense that this party isn't there to fight for you, because if they were, on the one hand, the party is telling you that this is the most important election of our lifetime, democracy is on the ballot, and Donald Trump is an authoritarian threat to every American's lives. And yet they put forward a candidate who can't seem to hold himself together in a debate and has done the least amount of interviews and press conferences of any recent president in modern history. And so if democracy was on the line and if American lives were threatened by Donald Trump, why would they put forward such a risky candidate in the form of Joe Biden, and then put forward Kamala Harris through an undemocratic process? I think that made things even worse for a party that was perceived as being self-interested, and perceived as a party that was lying about the threats or blowing up the threats that Donald Trump represented, which frankly has a horrific cost to America, to the livelihoods and lives of Americans. Another key piece of this is that um, the erosion of key demographics, um, particularly amongst men, there the polling and focus groups I've seen with men after the election is that in the media there was such an in the mainstream liberal media there was such a um, personal hatred displayed toward Donald Trump. But if you look at non-college educated men of color, Black and Latino men, Donald Trump is perceived as someone who is his own man, is funny, is charismatic, is business savvy. He tells it like it is. And similar to Elon Musk, like Elon Musk enjoys a fair amount of favorability amongst the types of male voters who switched from Biden to Trump or from Biden to not voting. Obviously, that polling goes hand in hand because the polling goes with what they're, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but there was a misread in terms of making the election about Donald Trump's character and democracy. Related to that is that often the Harris campaign's paid advertisements were often about the economy and inflation, but the earned media interviews, the media appearances by Harris, the narrative in on online and offline was not about the things she would say in interviews were not about inflation or the economy typically. They were about Donald Trump's character and Donald Trump's threat to democracy, similar to the campaign of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Um, I think that another piece of this is that um, in similar ways to what Gabe has already discussed, there was an immense culture war waged by the Republican Party and Trump's allies over the past 4 years over issues like crime, immigration, and transgender rights. And the Democrats were asleep at the wheel on all three of those issues, or they adopted Republican light policies. And so um, we Democrats in blue cities, democratically controlled cities across the country, have joined in Republican attacks against progressive district attorneys, progressive people who want to reduce the prison population, people who want to invest more in social services and mental health services rather than policing and incarceration. Moderate Democrats like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and others associated with them have joined kind of the Republican narrative to say that these progressive criminal justice people are to blame for crime. And I think that led some of the attacks from Donald Trump to be more salient. Similar to attacks on the border and transgender rights, Kamala Harris left most of these unanswered or seemed very plastic in interviews when asked about it. She did not have her own position on these issues, and so it seemed like she was hiding something. In 2020, one of the key vulnerabilities of Joe Biden with low information voters was a perception that he was not his own man, meaning that someone of his age and inability to communicate effectively made it seem like he was an empty suit and a scion of the establishment and kind of nefarious forces of corruption and self-interested politics. That same critique, I think, that many voters said they feared about. So I don't want to skip ahead. The Biden campaign knew that in 2020 that was a major vulnerability for them. And so they did a lot to put Joe Biden in front of cameras and to do long form interviews and long form press conferences to make it seem like he was the agent of his own campaign and the decider of his own campaign and future presidency. Kamala Harris suffered from the same critiques of being an empty suit of the establishment for a lot of these voters, that many people felt that she had a position in 2019 that differed from her position on 2024 on these issues related to crime, immigration, and transgender rights. Nobody really knew what she actually believed in. And it's, there's a joke amongst most of the political press that Kamala Harris has no core convictions or beliefs. And I think that her quality as a candidate related to many voters. Uh, Issues with her. And so again, I don't think this is a major realignment, but related to the kind of things that happened and unfolded over the last 9 months. The last thing I'll say is that we, the center left and progressives are both losing the information war and the war for attention in a decentralized, uh, hyper attention focused media environment. And so, if you did consume your information from online sources like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, which is a large percentage of non-college educated working class voters, you were more likely to vote for Donald Trump or not vote. And part of that is like not is a distaste of kind of populist media, a condescension toward these mediums. And also part of it is that I don't know how Kamala Harris would have fared in some of these mediums like Joe Rogan. She is not able to carry, she does not seem able to carry that kind of conversation for 3 hours that I think would have made her more relatable. And for some reason, Donald Trump has a different standard applied to him than the center left. One of the biggest indictments is, as I mentioned, Joe Biden held the least amount of press conferences and interviews of any modern president, which is a horrific indictment of his presidency because voters need that kind of accessible relationship with the candidate or the administration that they're being asked to participate in essentially a referendum on. And Donald Trump and his allies were very much all over, made themselves accessible to all these media formats, not so much mainstream media, but alternative media and lifestyle media, gaming, sports, athletics, comedy, these kinds of things. I think we can learn a lot from the practices of Lopez Obrador in Mexico and Claudia Sheinbaum, who hold 3 hour daily press conferences that are supposed to be media spectacles, are populist, take questions from the media, and give voters a sense of what they're fighting for, what the challenges are ahead, and what they've already delivered, and where there is to go. I don't think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris felt it was their responsibility to do that, and instead relied on their laurels that the GDP is doing really well in the United States compared to other Western countries. And so there's a lot of rebuilding of trust and building of new infrastructure to solidify relationships with working class voters that I think needs to be the priority going forward. And yeah, to make the Democratic Party a party that delivers for working class people rather than talks down to them or talks around them are some of the key insights I have going forward.
Well, Waleed, thanks for that. It was really interesting. It prompts a lot of questions as well that we'll come back to about next steps in particular. Um, what is, to be frank, looking back now, the on the Harris campaign overall, it's very difficult because of the media coverage here. But some of the revelations subsequent to the election have been quite shocking. And also with Biden, that issue of not even grasping the opportunity of interviews at different stages to advocate for their own policies, which I thought was extraordinary, really. Okay. Our next speaker is Dan Denvir. Dan's the hoster on The Dig that many people on this who are listening will be following Dan and using over a period of time. In fact, most probably cribbing it for our speeches as well, actually. But there you are. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks so much. My name is Dan Denvir. I am the host of The Dig. It's a podcast that has everything from a 40-hour series of a history of 20th century Arab politics to recently an election postmortem interview with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. So we're missing her here today, but you can always check out my interview with her from a few weeks back. Um, I have a lot of thoughts. A lot of them overlap with Gabe and Waleed, two people I talk to about politics all the time. The Harris and Biden's resistance to doing interviews is a really interesting and important point. I think they don't do interviews for a reason. In Harris's case, obviously it's because she does not believe anything in particular. And she's kind of an extreme but exemplary case of a problem besetting the entire Democratic Party, which is that in this age of so-called popularism, the ascendance of popularism, I'm not sure if this term has made its way to the UK, but it's basically this idea that you have to poll test every single thing that you do before that you do it. And the thing is that voters know when you're doing that. I was at the DNC as the alternate uncommitted delegate from Rhode Island, which is my very tiny state below Massachusetts. And ahead of the convention, I was really dreading just the raw experience of having to sit in this arena for hours and hours and hours every day and listen to Democratic elected officials deliver speeches, because Democratic elected officials communicate in the most insincere, superficially high-minded form of pablum imaginable. It was, these speeches that are these kind of echoes of Obamaism well over a decade past Obamaism's prime, of just people calling for America to put their dreams together though, so that we can have a tomorrow that we all can dream of. Just things that mean nothing at all. And that was hours and hours and hours every day. And the Democratic Party is full of shit. And I think voters know it. And it was this orgy of self-congratulation and unearned optimism amid a really severe cost of living crisis that the Democratic Party commentariat and leadership spent years denying the existence of. We see that throughout the economy, but I think most dramatically with the housing crisis. In Rhode Island, where I live, we've seen some of I think the largest increases of any metro in the entire country since 2020. And there was no meaningful response to that from the Biden administration. Biden did begin to make some important breaks with neoliberal orthodoxy uh, with the Inflation Reduction Act, but it was so geared to the needs of the new Cold War with China that it basically comprised all sorts of investments in manufacturing that there's no way those could be felt in a material way, that the material underpinnings of political consciousness, identity, and allegiance could be reworked in time. And there were, to Biden's credit, there were provisions when it was initially a bill called Build Back Better that would have more immediate impact, that would have um, dramatically improve people's lives immediately through extensions in care work and things of that sort. And those were blocked by the right wing of the Democratic Party, namely Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. But the basic point there is that the reorientation away from neoliberalism was very truncated, um, and too late, too little and too late to undo the damage that the Democratic Party has done over the past few decades of destroying the material underpinnings of the bonds between the Democratic Party and the organized working class in the United States that was created and built under the New Deal order. Um, the genocide in Gaza and foreign policy more general, I think also played major roles, but notably the mainstream media in the United States has so far as yet, I think, been extremely resistant to acknowledge that role or even really explore what that role might be. And one reason is, the cost of living crisis and the basic failure, really kind of like functional inability to connect with working class voters around things like the cost of living crisis. That was more important. But the genocide in Gaza and foreign policy did play an important role in a number of ways. The last year was hugely polarizing over the war in Gaza. There were mass protests all over the country, college campuses taken over by giant encampments, um, and then turnout collapsed among precisely the same demographics opposed to Biden's Gaza policy. Whether we're talking about young people in a major city like Philadelphia or Arab Americans in Michigan. I think it's very clear that it played an important, if not, though not the most important, role in Harris's loss. A second, a second factor there is that Gaza combined with the war in Ukraine, even for, the majority of Americans who are certainly not, don't have kind of hard and fast left-wing anti-imperialist commitments, it added up to a sense that the world was on fire under Biden, that under Biden's watch, the world had swung into violence and chaos. Um, Another factor, I think, was that the total alienation of broad swaths of the left that after Bernie 2020, many of us had been very willing to work with the Biden administration. The rupture of that tentative, very fraught partnership that did characterize the first year or two of the Biden administration, that made, I think, and others have argued this, that made Harris moving to the right on the campaign trail an almost inevitable move, trying to make up in the center and with affluent suburbanites what she had lost on the left, things she did by campaigning with Liz Cheney, moving to the right on the border and immigration and on economic policy. I mean, some of the some of the analyses that have come out since the election are just remarkable in terms of the Uber executive and Harris brother-in-law, Tony West, really directing her campaign away from any form of economic populism and toward running around the country with billionaire Mark Cuban. So we end up in this surreal situation where each campaign has their own set of billionaires making the case for their candidate. Um, as Waleed said, uh, seeding the seeding the premises of the culture war, whether we're talking about immigration, crime, trans rights, seeding those very premises to the Republicans meant catastrophically that there was no alternate position articulated on them, and that guaranteed that the Republican advantage on all of them, which is obviously um, simultaneously a moral and more pragmatically political catastrophe. And a key piece there, and this is something that I worked on in my book, All American Nativism, is that really this was a surreal reprise of the very history that allowed Trump to rise to power in the first place, of Democrats, particularly from Bill Clinton on, working side by side with what are now considered, extinct mainstream Republicans, working side by side with them to move further and further and further right on immigration. This was the key prehistory that made Trump possible in the first place. So what do we need? I think we need a party that can offer a big, compelling alternative that resonates with people's common sense understandings of what their problems are. And again, Democrats tend to speak in just this mind-bogglingly vacuous um, language that does not make any of those kind of connections with ordinary people. Um, what does the left need to do? I think we need to focus on reorganizing power in this country at really the more tectonic level. That's the labor movement, which, as Gabe mentioned, is a relative bright spot, nowhere near the bright spot that we need it to be, but we do have militant left leadership of extremely critical unions like the United Auto Workers. I think we need to do work organizing tenants. This is a key constituency that can be organized for militant working class struggle. Also, kind of, you know, working into that the downwardly mobile middle class. This is a constituency ripe for organization given the intensity of the housing crisis in the U.S. A thing I forgot to mention in my introduction is I help lead an organization in Rhode Island called Reclaim Rhode Island that does housing justice work and is organizing tenant unions around the state. I think that this is precisely the sort of work that needs to be done. So many of the postmortems, we've heard centrist Democrats constantly talking about messaging. And if it's about messaging, as long as people are talking about messaging rather than power, that's a sign that they're missing the actual nature of the problem, because it's precisely a Democratic Party that transparently thinks about everything in terms of poll tested messaging that comes across as full of shit to the majority of American people. I think the left needs to focus on accomplishing big things at the city and state level in the many places where we continue to exercise substantial power. We're definitely shut out of getting anything done at the federal level. But this is a big country with a lot of big cities and big states. And I think there's a lot to do there, including specifically around housing justice, whether that's winning rent control or creating new social housing programs. I think looking forward, we need to ensure that we don't um, don't fall into the trap of retreating into sort of a purely domestic, insular, social democratic mindset. In some sense, the left's tentative alliance with Biden was premised on just that. But we can't ignore questions of empire or migrant rights or the border, not only for ethical reasons, but for practical political reasons. They will continue to come up and be points of sharp division and points of mobilization, of effective mobilization on the MAGA right. As Gabe said, we have seen liberal Democrats constantly talking about the fascist threat posed by Trump. But what they succeeded in doing this year is not stopping Trump. It was knocking out two of our most left-wing legislators, people that Waleed and Justice Democrats helped elect in the first place, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, who were targeted by AIPAC over their support for Palestinian liberation and opposition to the genocide in Gaza. And this really does pose a major strategic problem that I don't have easy answers for, because as Gabe said, the left does not have the power to govern without some sort of liberal coalition. And it's always the left that's being accused of being too pure to do compromise and coalition. But that's precisely backward. The left has been ready to work in coalition with a leftward looking liberal establishment. What we've seen over Gaza and over immigration is that liberals have rejected that coalition because empire and genocide matter more to them than defeating the MAGA right. And what we've heard from the Democratic establishment in the last few weeks is arguing absurdly that the reason Harris lost was because Harris ran too far to the left, which is so surreal. It's hard to wrap one's brain around. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that. I want to go to some of the questions that have come in, otherwise I'll be accused of hogging the discussion. Okay. Again, I'll have challenges of vanguardism or something like that if we're not careful. All right. The first question that came in was from Reinhardt up in Leeds. By the way, we've got people online and all the rest of it from right the way across this country. It's quite remarkable, the spread of people participating and sending questions in. What Reinhardt said goes exactly to Dan's final points, really, about strategy. And it was just a straightforward one, which I think mystifies us all quite a bit. Can the speakers explain why there is no political party with a radical left-wing agenda and substantive vote in the US? Reinhardt says, politicians such as Bernie Sanders try to promote their policies through the Democratic Party, but get effectively blocked by the establishment, the Democratic Party. Just going on from Dan's point in relation to this question, I can see how the work at state level and at that local level is absolutely critical. In some ways, it helps you prefigure what could be done at the federal, at the national level, and build support for that. But is the answer therefore that the long haul of doing that to build therefore an alternative party, or is it about making sure you've got a substantive majority for a repositioning of the Democrat Party? Waleed, do you want to come in on that as a strategist?
Sure. Well, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are like 10 parties within one party. So um, there's like the social democratic forces, there's kind of ethnic machines, there's the corporate wing, and um, it despite all of the comments and emails I received from supporters of the Green Party and Jill Stein, like they were pretty much a non-factor in this election, in part because um, the two-party system is kind of the laws of gravity in the United States, and we can either choose to engage in the laws that they exist or imagine something new. But I think most Americans are programmed in the two-party system. That said, I think the two-party system is also one of the factors for why the Democrats lost this election, because it is so difficult for the Democratic Party to have the majority um, to pass big laws, big policy results. And so if your political vision is dependent on delivering for working people, and two senators from your party who represent either red states or corporate interests can block your vision, then the two-party system makes it so that voters will always punish the party that almost always punish the party that is in power. And so, I was happy to see two fairly moderate members of the Blue Dog Caucus, which is kind of, I guess, what you guys would refer to as Blue Labor, came out in favor of forms of proportional representation immediately after the election, which I think is promising. But I mean, these reforms would have to take place on the local and state level, particularly in blue state trifectas, meaning that they hold local House, local Senate, and the governorship. But it's actually Democratic incumbents who are least likely to endorse proportional representation because it would threaten their ability to win seats against more progressive candidates. Last thing I'll say about this is that I think that the voters who control the Democratic Party, who are partisan Democrats, believe in the Democratic Party vision, are animated around partisan messages against Trump, and partisan messages for democracy, are the viewers of Democratic aligned media ecosystems like MSNBC, are the readers of Democratic aligned newspapers like the New York Times. Those are not the voters necessarily that you need to win a general election. And it goes back to where Gabe started, which is that the combination of upper middle class liberals and rank and file Democrats are so attached to Democratic Party branding that they can't see how some of Trump's appeal is that he is outside of the political establishment and a critic of the Republican establishment. And that in 2028, it would be very difficult for someone who is trashing the Democratic. My hypothesis is that in 2028, for someone to win the Democratic primary, even in 2026 to win a Democratic primary, trashing the Democratic Party brand would be a pathway toward almost assured defeat. And I think so there's this contradiction where like someone like Bernie Sanders, who's an independent, might be more competitive in a general election, but actually is part of his independent streak makes it harder for loyal partisan Democrats to vote for someone like that in a primary electorate, particularly upper middle class liberals and many African American voters for whom the Democratic Party is a political vehicle they've sought to integrate for decades. So yeah, and then one other forward-looking thing, and I'll conclude here, is that we are experiencing a much deeper backlash to progressives and the left than anything comparable to 2016. The moderate wing of the party was much more willing to accept some of Bernie Sanders' criticisms of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Democratic Senate Leader Chuck Schumer even endorsed Keith Ellison, who comes from the progressive wing of the party, to become the DNC chair. there is no goodwill toward the left, and frankly, much of the Democratic political and media and economic elite blames Biden for moving too fast, too boldly on the economy, on climate change, and there has become a groupthink that progressives are the reason for why Harris lost in a way that is very different, has a very different political environment than 2016 or 2017 that led to the rise of the Squad and AOC and the Green New Deal and the Sunrise Movement. The terrain is much less in our favor and much more in the kind of, I would imagine if I were a betting man, the politics of this moment would lead much more towards someone like Keir Starmer being set up, like the American version of Keir Starmer being set up to win an election in 2028 than someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or someone like Bernie Sanders. I'm curious what Gabe and Dan think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
go
a
ahead.
really it's a really interesting question. I think a counterpoint to the hypothesis that we're headed towards an American Starmer is that one thing we don't have this time around is a liberal resistance movement. There will be no women's march, or if there is, it will not be like a million people or however many it was packing the mall in early 2017. Instead, what we have is on the left, New York City DSA having to hold mass new member orientations like every night for like weeks. I don't know how long, but and these were mass orientations with 100, 200 people in them. Here in my tiny state of Rhode Island, our first general membership meeting at Reclaim Rhode Island after the election, attendance doubled, and it was all new people adding to that increase. That's an interesting. I'm not quite so sure. I think Waleed might be right, but I'm not sure. Thankfully, gratefully, I'm not sure he is. I hope he's not, but he might be. Um, and then the Democratic Party question. I mean, this is a very fundamental problem for the American left, though, as the UK shows, having a multi-party system is no panacea for the left. It can feel like it is from the US case, where we're so caught in a two-party system where the two parties essentially being the sole routes of access to state power is like enshrined in law, essentially, in so many ways. And this leads to so many different problems, including that the left constantly fights amongst itself in a very confused way where the basic terms of the problem and the possible solutions aren't even clear to the various sides. This consumes so much energy in the US left, whether to stay or to go. Um, Two quick thoughts on whether to stay or to go. Um, First is that, when I was 17, one of my first major involvements on the American left was becoming a very ardent campaigner for Ralph Nader's Green Party presidential campaign in 2000. Um, Compare that third party presidential campaign to Bernie 2016, which was a run in the Democratic primary. And I think it's very clear that Bernie 2016 had a much more was much more consequential for building left-wing power in the United States, like orders of magnitude more consequential. So that is an argument in favor of, not in favor of a of eventually realigning the Democratic Party as a left-wing party, though I'm open to that debate, but just more pragmatically short term in favor of running in Democratic primaries now. That said, Bernie, of all, the independent who did this by running as a on the for the Democratic presidential nomination, he, after this election, has called for people to return to his initial approach when it makes sense. And an exemplar of the sort of race that this might make sense in is in Nebraska, where a union leader that most Americans had never heard of before, named Dan Osborne, ran as an independent in Nebraska, a very, very Republican state, and got pretty damn close to winning. So places like that, where you know, are are potentially interesting opportunities.
I'll
Dan,
just add, oh, sorry, go ahead. It's fine.
just to say to you, you're contrasting the US system of two parties with ours as though we are a multi-party system. We're a very narrow, because of first past the post, without proportional representation, that breaks down to a large extent, even though reform has now emerged on the far right. That's as a result of the shift to the right by the Tory party as well. But it's not much of a contrast. That's all I'm saying. Dan has set out sort of a mixed strategy, Gabe. Sort it out, will you?
Huh. Well, I think, just 2 points that have already been alluded to, but are worth making more explicit is one, that the two-party system essentially has the force of law. It doesn't quite literally. I mean, it is legal to form a third party and run it, but it's just the obstacles, for example, in getting onto the ballot are far worse here than I think that, for example, they would be in the UK. And it absorbs almost all of the energy of an effort like that, not to even wage the campaign, but to be able to begin the campaign. And so that is a traditional kind of major obstacle. And then there are also important social groups and social forces that any serious left effort would have to enjoy serious support, which are institutionally integrated into the Democratic Party in important ways. One is organized labor, in particular in the public sector. Organized labor, depends on essentially the favor of Democratic policy makers and politicians, and so is simply structurally unwilling and unable to oppose them in any, even in intra-party contests most of the time, much less going external to the party. And organized labor in general, with important exceptions, is and has been for many years in a kind of defensive posture, where it depends on the support of Democratic politicians to keep it alive. Well, obviously, couldn't imagine a serious socialist politics without the labor movement. And so that's one version of that. Waleed alluded to another, which is the historic relationship between the African American electorate and the Democratic Party, arising essentially out of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And this is a really important paradox. In my view, it's one of the kind of problems around which the Sanders efforts failed. In terms of opinion polling or surveys, Black voters in this country are to the left of the rest of the country on virtually every issue. And if Keeanga were here, I know this is one of her major kind of areas of thought and study. But in terms of political behavior in elections and internal party primaries in particular, Black voters have emerged over the last couple of decades as the kind of real rank and file of the party leadership. And that has to do with the sense of the Democratic Party as a kind of defensive structure around the achievements of civil rights. It has a certain kind of a logic to it. It's one that I hope we can figure out how to break on the left, but it has a certain kind of a real logic to it. So from my perspective, exiting the Democratic Party and pursuing third-party politics, although I agree with Dan that there are cases like this Nebraska case where it's really worth experimenting with. And I do think we should look for opportunities to do so. It also involves risking real separation from these two vital constituencies for left-wing politics. And inroads there, it seems to me, depend on social movement activity much more than electoral activity. There are significant democracy movements in many of the trade unions. One has captured the United Auto Workers in the past couple of years for the first time, and that has been of massive significance, as Dan said. In particular, I think the main next opportunity for that is in the teachers union, which is an enormous union and a significant player in Democratic Party politics, but is quite undemocratic and in its internal structures. So I'm cautiously hopeful that the wave of teachers militancy at the local level that we've seen play out over the past decade, that we can figure out how to turn that into a struggle for control of the teachers union in a different kind of way. And then in terms of African American politics, I think that although it's true that Black voters in general, supported Biden over Sanders in 2020, supported Clinton over Sanders in 2016. That is generationally different. That varies across generational lines. So the young Black voters actually, I think, don't produce that same kind of relationship of defensive loyalty to the party. Now that opens them, especially with men, to voting for Trump in a new way, but I think it also presents a kind of social movement opportunity to develop a clearer, and I think it obliges us to develop a clearer account of the changing forms of anti-Black racism in this country, the kinds of obstacles that represents to the flourishing of young Black people. Policing is a classic place where we've tried to do that with some public opinion success and some defeat. But there's a wider range of issues where I think it's incumbent on the left to develop and advance that analysis in order to make inroads or to enlarge the inroads we have made with young African Americans in particular. And there's probably some overlap between that and possibilities of new forms of trade union organizing, in particular in the kind of marginal service economy where younger workers in general are stuck.
George Binet, who's one of our, I think he's retired now, George, union organisers over here, he put the question in specifically about the unions. And I'll say the US has sunk an upsurging union struggle that arguably started with the Red for Ed strike action in 2018 during Trump's first presidency and clearly intensified during Biden's term of office. Can unions in the US really cause significant problems for a Trump administration? Do you think there's the prospect of that? Are they going to be strong enough? Will there be sizable union reactions to Trump policies, or will there be incorporation?
Maybe I know I just talked, but maybe I'll start on this. I think I'm the labor person of the three of us. I think we'll see contradictory reactions. So on the one hand, there are parts of the labor movement that have attempted to find a rapprochement with Trump, in particular the Teamsters, who are a very large and powerful union, notably declined to endorse Harris, which is quite unusual for American labor unions in recent years anyway. And they got the person they wanted for Secretary of Labor, who is a kind of unusual pro-labor, relatively pro-labor Republican. At the same time, the Republican Party is extremely internally divided in terms of whether and how to court organized labor, because it also is fundamentally a party of the billionaire class in a different way. There has been a kind of move toward a pro-worker conservatism, a pro-worker Republican kind of faction, but all of their actual substantive policy proposals involve kind of giving forms of symbolic voice to workers while constraining their ability to actually be a force in politics. So I think it's relatively unlikely that we will see the kind of tender of a pro-worker Republicanism made good in a meaningful and substantive way, although they may succeed in dividing the labor movement somewhat further, right, as they've already begun to do with the Teamsters, where, among whom the politics of immigration, for example, are quite explosive, and that's a powerful device for the right there. That being said, I think it's worth remembering the moment in the first Trump administration when there was a standoff. We have this insane system in the United States where we have to kind of vote to essentially make good on the US's federal debt, all the time, and this becomes a kind of choke point in American politics of constant kind of standoffs. And there was such a standoff that led to a shutdown of the federal government briefly in the first Trump administration, which was brought to an end by a strike threat by the flight attendants union, which is a relatively progressive union, quite small, but you can't fly a plane without flight attendants. It's illegal. And obviously, shutting down air traffic is enormously consequential in the American economy. And that's not the only force like that, right? Even without the Teamsters, right? We have seen increasing militancy among rail workers, certainly auto workers, and then in the service economy, right? Teachers and nurses and so on. I think that it's unlikely that we'll see, a general strike for democracy or something like that, as seems possible in South Korea right now. But that to the extent that the Trump administration tries seriously to, attack some of the institutional bases of the labor movement, there are sources for resistance to that have appeared even in a weaker moment, like 2017 or 18. And the final thing I'll say is just that there is significant possibility that the National Labor Relations Act, the basic labor law that's been on the books since the 1930s, will be thrown out or severely weakened by the Supreme Court. A number of large corporations have essentially pursued this legal strategy, and our Supreme Court is extremely right-wing, so it wouldn't be shocking if it complied with that. That will open labor to massive new forms of repression if that happens. at the same time, it will open new avenues of struggle. That law has famously, constrains constrains unions as well as protecting them. And in particular, at the local and state levels, it will become possible to try to produce a more thoroughgoing pro-labor legal regime at the state level than is possible under the current federal regime. Because federal law preempts state law. If federal law is gutted, then state law might actually be able to go further. And in a context of very uneven militancy, but where there are small pockets of very militant workers, it might actually be possible to build up some of labor's bastions in a context of more aggressive attack on labor. It's sort of a paradoxical possibility, but I think we may see something like that.
It's linked to a question that came in from an anonymous attendee. He or she said, Trump seems likely to rip up the US Constitution in a variety of ways. The Supreme Court won't step in as a majority owe their positions to Trump. So what should or what could or would the left do in such a circumstance? Waleed? If there is major assault on the Constitution, what would the left do then? Is that another opening for the left?
Well, I think this is
Or
the
is it
kind of thing.
is there a possibility? That's what I'm saying.
There's definitely a possibility given the kinds of people he's nominating to the cabinet, who are openly anti lowercase d democratic and authoritarian. This is something that is primarily the kind of work that is done by liberals and leftists in coalition alongside civil liberties groups. The ACLU has been the major organization against the bill that I think Dan mentioned, which is quote unquote called the nonprofit killer bill in the United States, which is an example of what you're talking about, to essentially replicate Viktor Orban's strategy in Hungary, by choosing to go after kind of the least popular or the easiest to divide the Democrats on support of, which is quote unquote George Soros funded pro-Palestinian organizations. The goal is not to combat anti-Semitism or even policies critical of Israel. The goal is to go after George Soros, and like the liberal philanthropy. I think that in some of the other cases of authoritarianism, it's a really dangerous situation. Like the Republicans and Trump loyalists have captured much of the judiciary. Much of what Trump is able to accomplish will also be like legalized. For example, like he announced yesterday that he is pretty much in favor of deporting children of U.S. citizens, children of Americans who are undocumented. He's in favor of getting rid of birthright citizenship. He says he'll do it within the first 100 days. I think he will do something on deportations in the first 100 days, but that is likely going to be constitutional based on the reading of the Supreme Court, which decides those matters. And this is one of the places where, because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were defenders of democracy, defenders of the institutions, and defenders of the norm, the kind of liberal electorate of Democrats is not prepared in any way, has not been inoculated in any way for how the systems and the norms and the institutions will be weaponized by Trump in a way that might be legal, might be lawful. But like the Supreme Court is held by Trump loyalists. I'm not an expert in authoritarianism, but I can imagine that there will be a combination of contradictory things in which there are things that we might cry as illegal or unconstitutional, but because of the way the judiciary is set up, I'm pessimistic.
Dan, what's your view?
I think on the one hand, a difference between Trump 2016 and Trump 2024 is that Trump 2016, he had, all these so-called adults in the room, or conventional Republicans, restraining him from doing what he really wants. This time, his people like Stephen Miller, who's been, cooking up precisely how to orchestrate mass deportations simply using executive power. They've been, working on that for years. He has, there will be no so-called adults in the room. So on the one hand, that might make us afraid that he's going to be a far more effective far right president. But I mean, also just look at his how his nominations are faring so far. Matt Gaetz already out of the running for already withdrew for AG. Pete Hegseth, who is a real kind of neo-crusader, civilizational warfare, Islamophobe freak, is um, on the ropes for all of his philandering, accused sexual assault, alcoholism, etc. Um, One thing I think what we know for sure is that Trumpism in practice will immediately produce massive opposition, massive contradictions. He does not have majority support in the country. I think, as Gabe mentioned during his open remarks, the kind of mainstream liberals are um, uh, unable to lead. They insisted, they attempted to lead after 2016 in a completely ineffectual way of focusing on Russia, Russia, Russia constantly, which led them to believe that they could stop Trump by exposing the truth and, through like essentially like media exposure and legal and prosecutorial means, all of which obviously failed. This time, I don't think they even have an idea of what to do. But there will be contradiction, there will be mass opposition, there will be mass protest. We've consistently seen every year or two or three over the last decade, massive, massive labor action. Just earlier this year, massive student anti-imperialist protest, unlike anything we've seen in a generation. The question for the left will be how to take advantage of these moments that we can't make or predict to actually articulate them into something durable and powerful. And I think if we look back to 2020, this moment of historic mass uprising here, there were tons of missed opportunities there, tons of ineffectual leadership. And as the left, we really need to focus on building organizations of organizers, cadre organizations that are able to exercise effective leadership and make the most of these moments that we know will happen. We do not know what will spark them or what exactly they'll look like, but they are guaranteed to happen.
The comparison with here is that from 2010, when, well, before then, the Iraq War, obviously mass mobilization against it. But then from 2010, when the Conservatives were elected and austerity was introduced on quite a massive scale, that produced a whole range of oppositions, individual oppositions, people with disabilities campaigning, students campaigning, housing, all the campaigns that you've mentioned previously as well, and issues around civil liberties as well. And that never coalesced into one organization. There was different groups who were very effective in bringing some people together, People's Assembly, for example. But it did produce the raw material that eventually saw the election of Jeremy Corbyn into the Labour leadership and the potential of a close run thing in terms of the election in 2017. And the lesson for us from that as well is that the essential training of the cadres is absolutely critical for that. Otherwise, it's easy without the mass movement fully engaged and having its own sense of direction as well, with that underlying organizational base of organizers with experience. It's very easy then to be swept aside, or even if they throw everything against you, it might not electorally succeed. You need to leave at least some form of organization for the future. And I think that's one of the lessons from here. Look, we're running out of time, and unlike meetings that I chair physically, we could go on all night, but I'm afraid we're time restricted because it just cuts off at 8 o'clock. But I'm going to try and bring you back again, if that's all right with you. I know you might not think it's important to spend your time on the discussion around what's happening in the UK, but I think it would be really useful. And if we can contact Keeanga and when she's feeling better, when we can revisit. The reason I'm saying that is because I actually think the election in the States and the issues of the Democrat Party, have their role and their experience, prefigures and is a warning for the potential of the next election here, very significantly. And I'll just give you a quote. John Cruddas was a centre-left MP who's just retired. He's written a book on the century of Labour, the history of Labour. And I'll quote him. quoting someone else is quite useful, particularly if you've had the whip suspended from you and you're hoping to get it back. So let me just quote him. He's more mainstream than many, I suppose. He said this with regard to the Starmer. This is before the election, and he said it's difficult to identify the purpose of a future Starmer government, what he seeks to accomplish beyond achieving office. Labour appears content for the coming election to amount to a referendum on the performance of the governing Conservatives rather than a choice between competing visions of politics and justice. Now, many people fear, that's prior to the election, many people fear that the Starmer administration is governing on that basis as well. And if we don't learn the lessons of what happened to Kamala Harris, as you've set out this evening, particularly the left explaining those lessons more thoroughly, I think we could be in quite a dangerous situation where the equivalent here is Reform and Farage, an extremely right-wing Conservative Party. And we're already losing council by-election after council by-election. In a couple of polls last week, Labour came behind Reform itself for the first time ever. And so the lessons from America and what you've gone through and the lessons that you are now pointing out to us to learn, I think are absolutely key. If it's all right with you, I will try and prevail on your time, just to have this further discussion, okay? And if you want to think through some of the ideas about what you would think would be useful for us to learn and some of the roles that can be played, what I'll try and do is bring together yourselves with a couple of other people from the left in the UK and maybe have that conversation and a bit of banter about it as well, if that's okay. I want to bring in Ben Foley now from Arise, who's organised this session and a whole programme of activities and discussions, all of which have been incredibly successful in terms of stimulating political debate here. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks for that, John. Thanks for letting us to put in letting us use your meeting to put in a quick plug for Arise. So first of all, I do want to just do a quick ask if anyone can make a financial donation to help us out. Arise puts on a whole host of online and in-person left discussion events throughout the year on our trade union and our economic struggles, on challenging racism, on international solidarity. And there are various costs in terms of the tech we use, the mailing list, the streaming. So it's all done by volunteers. So if you can make a small donation of perhaps £10 or so, please do that now. I'm hoping a donation link will appear in the chat. So if you can help us, that would be great. And then I just want to do one very quick plug for our another upcoming event. So on our events, we have done, we've had a lot in the last month, the last 6 weeks or so. We've discussed the budget. We've discussed the very live debates around public ownership and the debates around transport and energy and water that are going on in the UK at the moment. And we've discussed politics in Ireland. And we've kept on discussing going back to events in Gaza and what we can do to support the Palestinians. The next event hosted by Arise is actually, following on from today, is actually another look at Trump and the Americas, but it's a look at how he will relate to Latin America with a simple title of Trump Hands Off Latin America. It's on Thursday, December the 12th. So it's actually on this week, and our speakers are from various speakers from across Latin America, including Mexico, Honduras, Argentina, Bolivia, and I think the Workers' Party from Brazil. But we also have Alex Main, the Director of International Policy at the Center for Economic and Policy Research from the US, from Washington. So that's our next event. It's on Thursday this week, and thanks for your support.
Thanks, Ben. Can I thank Dan and Gabe and also Waleed and send our best wishes to Keeanga and hope she recovers soon. The best question in the answer box, in the question box is, why have a title about the future but just look back? I think that's a terrific question. And I think it must be a reference to Gabe, your reference to Marx's 18th Brumaire. And the reason we look back is, to learn the lessons for the future. And I'll give you another plug as well for Fragile Juggernaut, the podcast that Gabe is doing as well, for people to look it up. Thanks for all the participants and thanks for all those who joined us as well. And as I say, if Arise will help us, we'll try and organise another conversation with the participants and invite Keeanga when she's better. Okay. Thank you, comrades. All the best.
Thanks so much.